Everything that we've drawn so far has been one colour, and if we want to change the colour of an object, then one of the ways of doing that is to look at the Properties panel on the Home tab. I'm just going to draw a line, and when I select it you can see that it's actually set by default to being the colour by layer. So this first drop down actually allows me to change the colour of the object, and you can see there's some predefined colours set out on here, and if I just select one of them, then that line will now be that colour. But that changes it on an individual basis. You can now see that because I selected the line first, I'm now set back to being by layer again, and anything else that I draw is going to be that colour. That's a slightly different method to actually selecting the colour first and then drawing the line, and that means that everything that I draw from here on in will be that colour. Okay, so I'm just going to set that back to by layer, and I just want to draw your attention to this More Colours button at the bottom. This will open up a dialog box that actually has three tabs. One's called Index Colour, which are these predefined colours. One that is True Colour, which allows you to select any colour that you wish, and a third one which has colour books, and these have recognised, worldwide recognised colours such as Pantone and RAL. On the index colour, the thing that I want to draw your attention to the most is the black, because it's quite tempting to, if you're not aware, to set the colour to either this black here, which is colour 18, or to use this black here, which is colour 250. But actually these are not the correct ones to use. I would recommend that you use this one here, which is index colour 7, which is a bit of a special colour, because when I click on there, although it's black, you can see that it says colour white. And what that means is that if I was to now draw a line using this colour, when I change the background to, let's say, black, colours, black, the colours automatically change to being white. That's different to actually using this one here, which is 000, where actually if I was to draw a line now, you wouldn't see it because it's black on black. So I'm just going to change my background to being white again. And you can see that that line did actually draw, it's just that it's not actually set to a special colour that will change depending on the background. It's set to a value of 000 on the RGB. So remember that you need to use the index colour 7 in order for that to change. The second drop down allows me to change the line thickness, and you can see that on here we have many line thicknesses, and if I was to select, let's say, 0.5mm, that is now set to being a thicker line. Now we can't actually see it at this point, and that's because we need to come down to the status bar and switch on the show or hide line weight switch, and if we click on that button you can now see the line thickness. By default this is switched off because it's actually easier to draw and see the end snaps when you don't actually have thicker lines on your drawing. But you can come down here and switch it on and off whenever you like. Remember, if you can't see that button, you need to come over to the right hand side and just switch on the line weight button so that you can actually use it. The third drop down allows me to change the line style, and by default you can see that there's really no line styles loaded in. That means we have to click on the other button and then click load, and you can see that there's actually a load of predefined line styles available to us. You can download others from the internet or create your own. We have to load these into our drawing on a drawing by drawing basis. So we're just going to select one. I'm going to select long dash double dot, click OK, and then click OK again. And now we can select our line and change the line style. And if I zoom in, you can see that that has now changed. All of this has been done on an individual basis for these lines, and that makes it really difficult actually when you start doing big drawings, because if I want to change any one of these attributes, that means I have to select every single line and change it in these drop downs, which isn't particularly great, and that's where the idea of layers comes in, which we're going to look at next. We should use layers to organise our work. The general concept of layers is that you can place different objects on different layers, and that will allow you to manipulate them, such as make them visible or invisible, or change the colour or the line weight or line style on a more global basis. So first we're going to have a look at the Layer Properties Manager and look at how we create and modify layers, and then we're going to look at some of the tools that we've got in order to manipulate them. If you've ever used an application such as Adobe Photoshop, then you'll probably be more than familiar with the concept of layers. And if you haven't, then I suppose you could consider them very similar to sheets of acetate stacked on top of each other that will allow you to place objects on each acetate. You can then switch on and off each of those objects and layers accordingly. Very similar to the way that Walt Disney used to draw years ago, having a background, a midground and characters on different acetates, so that when they wanted to change that scene, they didn't have to redraw the whole thing, they just had to manipulate or edit one element. So the first thing we're going to do is have a look at the Layer Properties Manager, and we get to that by clicking on this large button that says Layer Properties. Click on there and you'll see that we get this dialog box called the Layer Properties Manager. Okay, so we have 4 icons along the top here. The first one has an orange flash, and that is the one that we use to create a new layer. You can see that the shortcut there is Alt and N. It's worth saying that there is a default layer called Layer 0 that comes in with any new drawing on AutoCAD. It's automatically generated by the program itself. Just know that it exists, try not to use it, try not to do anything with it. It's probably worth, always making your own layers on top of the Layer 0. So we're going to create a new one here, and we're going to call it Lines for this example. And you can see that going across we have different columns that gives us some options. Now the first one is called On, and that has a little light bulb, and when it's lit the layer is visible, and when it's unlit the layer is invisible. The second column is called Freeze or Thaw, and we have a sun when it's thawed, and we have a snowflake when it's frozen. And that works very, very similar to the visible and invisible light bulb, except that it also, when it's frozen, takes the whole layer out of the program. It sort of temporarily takes it out of the computer's memory, so that AutoCAD will never reference it. Ideal to use if you've got large drawings and your computer's been a bit chuggish and you want to sort of speed the machine up. Freeze the layers and it will sort of reduce the amount of RAM being used by your machine and speed up the whole process. The next one is a lock, and you can see that we have a padlock, and it's unlocked or locked depending on whether you want to edit it or not. So if you've got a layer that's completely done, finished, and you don't want to change things by accident, then make sure that you lock it. The next column is the colour, and then we've got a line type and line weight, and this is very similar to the examples we've just been showing using the properties. So we can see that we can click on here and change the colour. We can change the line type, and we can change the line weight. The next one is transparency, and if you've ever used transparency in Photoshop, you know that you can make layers 50% transparent or 30% transparent. We can do exactly the same thing here. Then we have a plot column, which will mean that you can set this layer to not print out. So you could have it on screen but not actually print. And then the next column we're going to look at in a later tutorial. You can see this green tick in the status menu, and that means that that is the current layer. That means that if I was to do any drawing now, that's the layer that we would be drawing on. And you can see that at the moment this is set to layer 0. You can see that that is echoed up here. This is our current layer up here that we're drawing on, and this says layer 0. So I'm going to select lines layer, make sure it's highlighted, and use this little icon with the green tick. And now that is the current layer, and you can see that that is now saying up here that that lines layer is current. Okay, I'm going to create another layer called circles, and you can see that all the attributes from the layer before has been replicated. So I'm just going to set this back to being sort of a more default style layer. And that's probably about all you need to know really about the Layer Properties Manager. I suppose it's worth saying that there's a right click on these layers. You can do things like rename, all the sort of usual things you'd expect to be able to find on sort of a right click context menu. And there's some, further down there are some other sort of useful things such as select all, clear all, invert selection. So if you've got several of these selected, you could change the selection that you've got. And you can do some sort of more global things such as thaw all layers, or make all layers visible, that sort of thing. If you want to delete a layer, then you need to click on the icon here with the red cross through it, but it's worth saying that you can't delete a layer if it's got content on it. So you have to have the layer completely empty before AutoCAD will let you delete it. To close down this window, we can either click on the white cross on the edge of the dialog box, or just click on this big Layer Properties window button again, and it will disappear. So that's how we create and modify layers. And if we want to use them on a sort of a more general basis, then we need to look at this drop down here, and you can see that this is where we can set the current layer, and we can change some of these global settings. So let's have a little look at how this works. We're on the lines layer, so I'm just going to get to my line tool and draw some lines in here, just so we've got something to look at. And then want to draw on the circle layer and put some circles. So I come up to this drop down and select the circles layer, and now I can draw some circles. And you can see that when I hover over any of these objects, I get a pop-up that tells me the layer that it's on. You can see that it says layer circles. If I hover over this one, you can see that it says layer lines. So the next thing we're going to look at is how we actually switch on and off the visibility for these layers. It's very simple. You come up to the layer drop down, and you can use the light bulb. So if I wanted to switch off the circles layer, switch on there, and it's going to warn me that this is the current layer and I'm turning this off. Click on off, yes, and you can see it's now disappeared. I can make it visible again by switching the light bulb back on. If I want to change the colour of this circle, I can just click on the button for the colour and select another colour. Let's go this red, okay, and now you can see that that's now echoed through. And just to sort of bring everything up to date in terms of everything we've covered, if I wanted to change one of these lines, you can see that it's actually set by layer for the colour. So that green is being taken from the layer property, which is green. I could actually come over here and change this to a different colour. And you can see that this is now taking its colour reference from the properties rather than from the actual global layer choice. This means that if I change the colour of the layer, so for example, if I change it from green to blue, that all the lines will change, but of course this one won't, because it's not set to being by layer. It's set to its own colour on this properties window. I have to set it back to by layer for it to pick up the colour of the layer choice. For the next example, I've created 3 layers, one called rectangles, which sits alongside lines and circles layer. I've created some objects. I've created a rectangle that sits on the rectangles layer, the circle is on the circles layer, and the lines, of course, are on the lines layer. Now, at the moment, I'm currently on the rectangles layer, and that means that if I was to create another rectangle, it would be on the rectangles layer, and it would take on the properties of that layer. So, for example, green lines. And that is because my colour reference is set to by layer. Now, if I select another object, so for example this circle layer, you can see that once it's selected, it will show me up here what layer this circle is on, and quite rightly it's on the circles layer. If I want to move an object from one layer to the other, I select the object, and then I can select a different layer. So for example the rectangles layer, and now that has moved across, it's been pulled into the rectangles layer. That means that you've got to be really careful about having objects selected before changing your current layer. We also have some additional tools underneath the drop down in the layers panel. I'm just going to show you some of these right now because some of them are very useful. So for example, this one here called off, if I click on there, it asks me to select an object and it will turn that layer off. That saves me having to go in and switch on and off all these light bulbs to make layers visible and invisible. I have also got an undo in this little drop down here. There's an undo called previous, which will undo the changes of layer properties. This is separate to the main undo and redo buttons that we have for the actual whole drawing. So if I click on previous, you can see that it returns back to how it was. The next one is called isolate. With isolate, I click on the button and I can select one of my objects and press enter, and you can see that it's now isolated just that one layer. I switched off all the others so that I can concentrate on drawing with this layer. Underneath here, I also have a button that says unisolate. Click on there and it will restore and basically unisolate everything that it isolated. If you find that it actually locks and fades the layers rather than switching off the visibility, then you need to go back to the layers properties menu and come over to this little cog in the top right hand corner, and there's a setting in here called isolate layer settings, lock and fade or off, and if you find that it's fading them, then you need to select off on the radio button and then click OK. Redo it and you'll find that it's now behaving as you'd expect. The next button allows us to freeze a layer, and then we have a lock, an unlock, and we also have a make current. So we could select, at the moment my current layer is rectangles, I could select a line, select make current. Now my lines is the current layer, and that saves us having to come in here and select it. We also have a drop down menu that has the ability to save layer states. So for example, if I set these up in a way that I wanted, so for example I wanted layer 0 off, layer circles off, and these two on, instead of having to come and do that every single time, I could save it as a layer state, a bit like a queue I suppose. I can come into here, click new layer state, call this rectangles and lines layers for example, and click OK, and now this is a saved state. I can change it at any point, so let's say that I switched on other stuff. There's all my layers back on, and to get back to that layer state I can now quickly come down here and select that one, and it will return it to that saved state. Very useful when you've got larger drawings. Some of the buttons are more global, just to save you a lot of time. So for example, this one here will turn all layers on, this one will thaw all layers, and that really just saves you having to come down here and work your way down the list, switching everything on and off. It's just a sort of time-saving device, really. So have a look through these settings, they're very useful, and have a look at the tools available to you. You'll probably find that you use quite a lot of them quite a lot of the time.